Welcome to Midland. Welcome back to Midland.
Good to be here.
You're awesome. I just heard Kyle talk about you.
That was someone else's bio. It's a
Very
little awkward to
accomplished.
start out that way, but thank you, Kyle.
I'd prefer to have someone else introduced in between us next time. That'd be all right, Kyle. Just a little buffer.
You do claim, though, as far as we know, the only living graduate of Harvard Business School that also leads worship at a church.
Lead. There's a reason
Well,
it's past tense.
All right.
Yeah. And you are you claim the distinction of being the only person I know with 3 degrees. And not one of them from Texas Tech. Not one of them. My theory is you didn't get in when you applied, and that spurred you on. You were like, I got this thing I've got to now clear. I got to get 3 Ivy League diplomas.
Let's go with that.
Did it.
Feels good.
You did it. Okay, so let's set the stage a little bit. Starting out in your childhood, you grew up in Pensacola, Florida. As I've heard you refer to it affectionately, the Redneck Riviera.
It is. L.A., Lower Alabama. It's also home of the throwed mullet. There it's a fish and not a hairstyle.
Yeah.
We can
Maybe
catch up more.
both.
It's probably both, yeah.
So one of the more interesting stories I remember you telling about your childhood was about the time you got a Palm Pilot when you were like 12. And I just thought that might give us a little bit of an idea of what childhood Evan might have been like. You tell it.
Yeah. Well, this is a little embarrassing. Wait, first of all, I appreciate you guys coming out for this lunch. I've been in and around the world of mostly men who are believers trying to figure out what our faith and the Bible and relationship with Christ means for our work in the marketplace. And so just appreciate the leadership making these conversations happen, and for you guys investing an hour and a half and trying to figure this stuff out. It's super important. It's super hard. And hopefully we'll just tell you some ways that at least I and maybe Jordan have been messing it up over the years, and you might take something from it. But appreciate you guys being here. And the only thing better than talking about 40 minutes about yourself being embarrassed the whole time is to have someone interview you and be embarrassed a little bit less. So that's why we're doing this format. So Palm Pilots, let's see. As a kid, my grandfather was a manager of a J.J. Newberry store, which is a retail store, which basically his job was knowing the whole town. And I would always hang out with him and walk around the store where he got to know all of his obviously all of the clerks, but all the local townspeople that would come shop at the store and sit at the soda fountain for a while. So I really looked up to him, and I just took that posture on. So my favorite Christmas gift ever, it was my fifth grade, I think, was one year my brother, 4 years older than I, got the same gift wrapped, and it was a Palm Pilot. And my brother opens it and is like, this is the lamest thing I have ever seen, and promptly hands me his. So I ended up with 2 Palm Pilots in 5th grade. And I put all my classmates' mailing addresses in the Palm Pilot and then sent them Christmas cards, which is a really weird thing to do. But just for me, I love people. They're distracting and fun and challenging, and it started early.
When I first met Evan about a decade ago, when we became friends, I learned shortly thereafter that he had all of his friends and contacts in a database, and actually kept track of how long it had been since he talked to him or sent him a note or touched base with him. And I quickly learned that I had much ground to cover in terms of being a better friend. So that definitely carried over from childhood. And I'm guessing as a child, you probably didn't just get you didn't turn awesome when you went off to college. You probably did some stuff growing up. What was life like for you kind of growing up? What were the things you were interested in? What did you do? Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's some good things. I think there are early sins and idols in my life, too, as a young person. I grew up going to Presbyterian church. We were there 4 days a week for rec league and rummage sale and Wednesday night supper. And growing up, I don't know if it's like that in Midland, but in Pensacola, everyone kind of went to church all the time. And for me, it was just like what you did. And so just the radical nature of the gospel was, I don't even really know what it was. It was sort of like a rec center where they occasionally read things from this book. And maybe we'll get into that story later. But grew up around that. I think always had some sense of both opportunity and this obligation to do something big for God. This is still a challenge I have, which is just assuming that God needs me more than I need him. So I still think about that all the time. There were healthy parts of that aspiration, I think, growing up there of I want to go bigger, I want to do better, I want to work really hard. There were some really bad parts about that too. I think attitudes about, being better than other people. Like, can we please escape this town? What has anyone here ever done? Just stupid, childish attitudes. And later, going back and peeling back more of the layers of seeing my parents. Now, we're calling them to come visit their grandkids. And my mom's like, well, we're really busy this week. I'm like, what do you have? She's like, well, we've got the Bridge Club Ladies Luncheon on Tuesday. Thursday's the bell choir. We have the choir rehearsal on Friday, but the bell director's out of town. We've got the new organist coming in on Saturday, and the poinsettias come in for delivery Saturday night. I'm like, what are you doing with your life is what I want to say. But I actually know that that's where all their incredibly deep relationships are. They're deep friendships of people that, know their story and show up for them.
So Pensacola, next logical step, of course, Princeton. How did you choose Princeton? How did you wind up at Princeton? Walk us through that.
Yeah, true story, dream school was University of Florida. It was all based on your ACT scores, and if you did okay, you went to Florida State and really wanted to go to University of Florida. I just took a lot of tests and prepped and was sort of nerdy and science fair and math counts, and people went to
debate camp, right?
Normal people, you guys are normal and socially adjusted. You guys go to sports camp where you play athletic things. And I went to debate camp where you practice drills with a pencil in your mouth, and it helps you move your tongue less so that you can speak faster. This is a real thing. There's a documentary on Netflix that I'm not in, but thank the Lord, but you can watch. It's very silly. 3 summers, 8 weeks long debate camp. And you prep all summer because if you win the tournament at the end of the summer, it shapes your seed for the tournament of champions for the following year. It's all the cool kids are doing it. Yeah. So anyway, did really well on tests. And I got a letter from Princeton that said, we'd like you to come visit the school. And literally, I'd never been to New Jersey. And my understanding of Princeton was from the Fresh Prince of Baehr. And I was like, Carlton Banks, he seemed kind of cool. But I don't know, let's go check it out. So went there, had just amazing experience, got to meet Robbie George on my visit there, and my understanding of these places where they're crazy and liberal, and they are that, but I had a really contrasting experience. I went to Stanford for Admitted Students Weekend, and there was a student host that took me around, and in one night we went to 8 different parties. There was the Native American party, and there was the lesbian party. We went to all these different parties, and the last party was at this place called the Enchanted Broccoli Forest, which is one of their fraternities, and I was offered acid at the door, and I didn't know what it was, I didn't use it, and I was just like, if I come here, I will die, literally. So anyway, go to Princeton, and found, strangely, this amazingly, it was small, but this pretty receptive Christian and Jewish, relatively conservative little cabal of people there.
Yeah, so you mentioned meeting Robbie George. For those who aren't familiar with Robbie George, give us a little 20-second background on good old Robbie.
So you guys probably know the facts in sort of Ivy League schools. Basically all the faculty are extremely liberal. Very few are still standing that are remotely oriented towards Western civilization. Robbie George happens to be very conservative, very Catholic, a professor of philosophy and natural law and civil liberties, and he has this little cabal of students. What I so appreciate about him, I was in a freshman seminar that he co-taught with Cornel West, the African-American sort of preacher, scholar guy who wears black suits and has a gap between his teeth. An extremely liberal person. What's so cool about their friendship is it was a course where Robbie picked 10 books and Cornell picked 10 books. And they would each have to teach the other person's book for the seminar. And they just illustrated, I've seen it later on at Bots. Frank Wolf, who was Republican, was very close friends with Nancy Pelosi. I've had a few pairs of people in my life that disagreed about almost everything, but had this awesome relationship of mutual respect. And it's something that, both sides, Christian, secular, and liberal and conservative, are really failing at now. So that's Robbie, and he just has a really special place that he's carved out there.
So going back, when you got to Princeton, were you already a believer? By the time you got to Princeton, did you already have a meaningful relationship with Jesus, or was that?
Yeah, well, even saying something like a meaningful relationship with Jesus, I'd be like, are you at Jonestown? That's the craziest cult-like language. And I just had it on me to, I show up there, I brought a Bible that I'd gotten in confirmation class that had a lamb on the front of it. And so I go, and there's student activity fair, join the fraternity, whatever, and there was a little group of, the lame Christian corner. I was like, I'm a Christian, I think I should go join one of those things. So I picked one, and I happened to end up at Princeton Evangelical Fellowship, which was the most sort of evangelical of all the ministries. There was Athletes in Action, there were cool kids ones, this was not the cool kid Christian fellowship. So I'd go to it and show up the first week, and all these kids were there with Bibles that were, they had read them, they were tattered and torn and had been cried in, and pages were marked. And I was like, have my little lamb Bible, like super embarrassed. And so it was just an amazing experience. Fast forward that spring, they asked me to go, all the freshmen were invited to go on a missions trip to Chile. My Spanish was decent, and it was a missions trip, not like building houses, but like door to door. Knock on the door, my friend from America has a story to share with you. This is a very uncomfortable thing for a PCUSA church member. And so we're flying down there and we're preparing our testimonies, and you're supposed to write your this crazy experience that you had. And you're like, write your testimony. I'm like, peeking over at the neighbors, like, my name is John. And anyway, so I write this lame testimony that was not wrong, but it was just lame. And anyway, now my testimony is about that trip. And we go door to door, and through pretty poor Spanish, I'm trying to articulate, I took a week, I spent a bunch of money, I flew all the way here because there's this story about this guy. And how you believe, and if you believe about did he die and was he resurrected, your answer to that question changes everything. You can't be neutral to that as a point. You must take a side as to that question. And some people were like, you're crazy, and they closed the door. But there were other people that were like, I've never heard of that before. Like, how do I learn more? So, classic missionary experience, I guess. I come back to Princeton, I had the boldness to go tell someone that I will never see again around the world, but my roommates, I don't know, that's really terrifying to me. So ironically, I go to Princeton, become a fired up evangelical conservative Christian, and I'm sample size one of one. I think it's never happened before.
Pensacola, Princeton, evangelical Christian.
Yeah.
You're on the standard track so far.
Right.
I know you met a lot of people that have been influential in your life while you were at Princeton, but namely Chrissy. How'd you meet your wife?
Yeah, so I was a freshman, she was a sophomore. We were involved in a Christian fellowship overlapping group, and so kind of met casually through that. She was very wise. She sort of told me about what courses to take and all this stuff. And then I learned that she was involved in the leadership of the college Republicans. And I was like, I think I really like this girl. So I started learning more about what they're up to. And one of my worst decisions of my life, my friend who was a freshman, we kind of decided that the leadership of the college Republicans wasn't really cutting it. They weren't conservative enough. So we read the bylaws and orchestrated a coup to have the members show up with leadership not there, and per the bylaws, vote them out of office. And so my first real meaningful relationship was ousting my wife from the college Republicans of Princeton.
How long did it take before she spoke to you again?
It was a good year. Yeah. It was a long time. She studied abroad for a year in South Africa and came back, and she was like, you're a little bit less of a jerk now. And it was just only a little improvement. But that was the beginning. And so she had grown up in an interesting way. Her dad is from Texas. She grew up in New York City, and so had lots of Texas affinity. And I had a bunch of roommates from Texas in college. And so my Texas roots were planted, back at Princeton, ironically.
Back in the Princeton days. So where... obviously you graduated. I've been led to assume, I've assumed you graduated. What did you do after graduation?
Yeah, so I studied in the policy school, studying with Robbie. I got really convicted about taking the biblical worldview out into the world and kind of trying to ask the question, how do you conform the world around you to the biblical worldview? Because when people practice what our Creator designed and laid out for us in this instruction manual, what happens? The thing that He built works. It works, right? When you follow the manual for your car, the designer wrote the manual, knows what needs to be done to it to have it perform. I think that's true for how humans flourish too. My initial interest was going to policy and law. There's a lot of young people that love America. They're like, I'm going to be a lawyer. So I went to DC. I'd worked at some think tanks. I worked in the White House, and then was working on Capitol Hill, working on U.S. foreign policy to majority Muslim countries. So it's this deeply legal, pretty arcane but important area of law. And then just to fast forward a little bit on the legal point, essentially end up in law school, meet Peter Thiel, who kind of introduced me. You guys already know this. Today will mostly be me saying things that you already know, just to establish as a pattern for today. But he was like, don't waste your life, don't be a lawyer, build businesses. Businesses are what have the opportunity to conform the lots of the world around you, to employ people and treat suppliers and customers with respect and dignity and change the world much more quickly. So I had a few years, enough to learn some of the ways of Washington, and then had a course correction.
So you went and got your MDiv at Yale, which I'm sure was a fun experience as an evangelical Christian, and that's where you first met Peter Thiel, right?
Right. Yeah. So I wanted to go to law school, and I also wanted to take time. I had a great few years at Princeton just on my own, trying to study the Bible. I just drew an interest in theology. I don't know if you guys have tried to pick up John Calvin or Luther or some of these texts that are amazing. And I said, these are such important truths that I really had not thought about kind of until I was in college. Isn't it worth taking a few years to actually study those things? So Yale was interesting. My wife was there. There's law school. There's divinity school. I can go there and kind of do all this. And I knew it was a more liberal place, but I thought, we're all studying the Bible. Won't we all pretty much agree? Well, we didn't. We didn't agree a lot. Yale's an interesting place. It's a very liberal place, but it's a very faithful place, the divinity school, which you'd imagine. Harvard doesn't believe in God, and they kind of try to. They're very politically liberal, and they don't believe in God. Yale at least has the God part down, but has really strange ways of thinking about the world. One of my favorite stories is the campus feminist, the divinity school feminist organization, had a bone to pick. They were really frustrated at this protest around the coming Christmas vigil, which is something they still have in this beautiful chapel at Divinity School. There's a choir and all these things. It's candlelit service, like you guys may go to. And the contrast, the conflict was really that we were finally drawing attention to the Divinity School for years had been using candles shaped like penises. And I heard this and I said, this is the craziest thing. They're using penis-shaped candles? What ridiculous joke is this? So I knew the dean and I go meet. I'm like, we use candles that look like penises? He said, Evan, we use candles. They're just a column. They are not penis-shaped candles. They are candles. So sure enough, the Divinity School was enlightened that indeed this candle was to represent the patriarchal penis of a god. And so we abandoned that plan and we used disc-shaped candles. And the only problem with the disc-shaped candles is it burns the hell out of your hand because it's not a candle. Anyway, so I honestly went in. I have a lot of respect for the mainline church, and many loyal people have tried to stay to preserve the believers in mainline Protestant America, and that is a really worthy cause. There are people that are leaders in the mainline church that I think really see it as an opportunity to have political victories. And so seizing institutions like divinity schools or general assemblies of these things, it's really politicized the church in difficult ways.
So after Yale and the penis-shaped candles, you went up to Harvard Business School, and actually you had a little bit of a break in there working for Peter Thiel, but when you got to HBS, one of the things that I thought was interesting was that you put together a group of guys even before y'all got to HBS and the role that played. Tell us a little bit about that group and kind of what y'all did.
Yeah, so through all these things, like I love people. I loved, these were curated sets of really interesting people. Some were Christian, some were conservative, and we had Bible studies and accountability groups, and those were amazing things. The challenge was that we kept moving every few years, and so if you change cities or change jobs, you kind of hit reset on your set of friends. So a crazy God thing for us, we're heading into Harvard Business School. I had about 13 guys that I knew who were believers going the same year, and then an administrator there said, here are a few other guys. So it's a month before school starts. We have 17 guys on a conference call. We actually do 2 of them because they went so long, sharing their testimonies with each other, all in the same entering class the same year at business school, which was just a really crazy thing. So that group met every week over those 2 years, and now we're 8 years out, and a core group of that, 7 guys. We text daily. We do a video call every month, and then we meet together for a long weekend every year to kind of run through a structured set of questions. And our kind of moment of realization for this was, we felt so connected at the time, but we knew we were all going to disperse and head to different cities. And we just said, it's never going to get any better than this. We are never going to find people that are more aligned and more understanding of what we're trying to do in our lives than the people right here. So let's just make this our community. So we've set out on something that's hard, right? We live in 6 different cities for the 7 guys. But we're 8 years in, and it's been really amazing. One way that God's used it in really interesting ways is, I think for us, a lot of life happened to a lot of us a lot sooner than we anticipated. Fertility challenges, death of a parent, marital difficulties, lost jobs, all sorts of stuff. And all those guys who were sort of type A, everything's going awesome for them type of people, you just don't think those things are going to happen that early. And so a lot of stuff starts happening to us early. The amazing thing about the group was, number one, it meant that there were always other people in the group that kind of knew your story. And it wasn't a question of like, oh, we're at this awkward Bible study. Is now the time to talk about this difficult thing? With old friends, it's like the glove that fits. You know, they know what's happening in your life. The other crazy thing was that there was almost never a case when a guy was walking through something as the only person in the group. There was usually one other person that had dealt with a similar issue. And so everyone in the group just says this is the most profound set of friendships we were given. In that, I'll just add briefly, number one, the key thing that made the group work was we had to expose ourselves enough to the other guys, especially being distributed, talking about and raising stuff early that was difficult for us. What that made possible for us was the gift of giving someone else authority in your life. And that's something that I find incredibly rare. We do it poorly in our group. But, I mean, ask yourself this question. You know, if you in your life, let's say you start being a real jerk, or you start drinking too much, or cheating on your wife, or whatever it is, you know, are there people that know you enough and see you frequently enough and then feel the permission to actually be in your life, to be in your business? And that question is, does anyone have authority in your life? I know for most of us, we never did, and we kind of only do with that one now.
So HBS, in between first and second year, you went to work for Sheryl Sandberg at Facebook, a small technology company. And then came back second year and I think had a job offer to go back to Facebook, but wound up deciding to go a different route. Tell us kind of more about that decision and what made you want to take that risk. Yeah,
so at this point in my way too long, boring journey, I'm thinking about...
You're like 32 by this point, by the way, so it's like, you know, it's a life for most people. But.
So we're at this point, I'm like, I want to do business. I quoted Rick Warren in my application to HBS. I later learned that the dean of admissions said I was the least scary evangelical they could admit. It's like, all right, you have no idea what shop I'm going to wreck, you guys. Anyway, least scary. So at this point, I'm like, all right, business is how we can do big things for the biblical worldview. And Facebook seemed like a cool way to do that. Part of that for me was I wanted to create, I love the vision of Adam and Eve in the garden, the creation mandate, to have dominion and to be a co-creator with God. That's a theology I find really beautiful. I also love the question, will companies exist in heaven? You know, like, will there be oil and gas businesses? Like, when heaven comes to earth, will we drill? Like, I don't think we'll have healthcare, right? So everyone will be cured. So if you're in healthcare, quit now. Like, I don't know. Will there be fracking in heaven on earth? I don't know. Maybe next time we can talk about that. So anyway, this guy, a dear friend of ours, Will Davis, who's from Lubbock, went to Tech. I was a dear friend in my men's group at HBS. We were kind of always talking about ideas. It was usually in the form of him suggesting ideas, which I would then explain why they're terrible. And then the last idea he shared was this kind of interesting idea. We'd studied with Clayton Christensen, this amazing man at Harvard who has this theory on disruptive innovation. We were limited government people. And the question we asked was, could you design a business that would strategically destroy part of the federal government? Which I think is a really fun question to ask. It's really hard to build a business that actually does that. So anyway, we got to the point, and it was, do you take this cool, high-paying, interesting gig at Facebook, or go on this crazy journey with no money raised, and we had kids and all this stuff. And at the time, I don't know, it felt like a stressful decision, but just the opportunity to do someone with whom you have total trust. As the end of the summer, Will and I sit down at this restaurant in Washington, D.C., and he says, all right, here's the deal. This business is going to be 50-50, because you're the only person that I know that if something happened to me, I would totally trust you to care for my family. And that kind of invitation to be in a business, I mean, I don't care what the business is, you're just like, I'm first in on the people, I want to go make this thing happen. So anyway, that was the invitation. I was like, all right, let's try this thing. So we set out to take down the U.S. Postal Service.
Just another Tuesday.
Yeah.
So when y'all started Outbox, what were some of the things you learned through that process? We can talk about what happened with Outbox in a minute, but
Right.
I just remember coming and visiting you guys, and y'all had to literally build everything from scratch. There was no way to scan mail. Y'all had to devise a system to do that. There was no. What did you learn in the process of building that company?
A meta point first. This guy Mike Maples, who was the seed investor in Twitter, was our seed investor and on our board. Mike had an interesting idea. He's a really deep thinker, and he said that the purpose of a startup is to generate learnings. So you like form a hypothesis, you then conduct activities like meeting customers or suppliers or whatever, but the purpose of a startup, until it generates revenue and profit, is to generate learnings. Which is like, wow, that's kind of really interesting. If you believe that to be true, you'd be a really good steward of like conducting a test, seeing what happened, and actually documenting those learnings. And he shared this about 6 months into the business. We're like, wow, that's really crazy. So we then implemented on Friday afternoon, the team would literally, each person had to share something they learned that week, which was just a cool discipline that we, 10 years later, we're still doing today. So lessons from it. Let's see. Well, a big one. So a partner / competitor of ours was the U.S. Postal Service. They have 600,000, they have 1 million employees, 600,000 vehicles in their civilian vehicle fleet, a SWAT team of 6,000 people. And we just, we thought government was bad, but we just had no idea like how bad it was. And we had worked there. We kind of thought we knew. So that was kind of one. What else? There were a lot of people that were just like real naysayers. And so stupid idea, definitely won't work, tried it, no possibility. And so I think developing some thick skin of like encountering the no. I love the line, it's like, if you think about a president of the United States, there are few people in history that have heard the word no said to them more explicitly than an elected president of the United States, right? Trump, Obama, anyone. 50 million people went to the voting booth and looked at it and were like, no, right? Like that's pretty crazy. And so if you frame it as, man, 1 out of 10, I'm going to get a yes. If you believe that, then you're going to run after those 9 no's with joy, right? You're just going to freaking run into that buzzsaw and just get torn up. And we did. So we got torn up, and it was more like 1 out of 40 on the equity side, but we got it put together.
So the basic premise of Outbox was that they would take your mail, would get received by the Postal Service, it would go through their facility, it would get scanned in, you'd be able to get it on your iPad and say, I want this physically delivered to me, I want this, you can recycle this, unsubscribe me from this, all this sort of thing. I still remember the first time I heard the pitch. I think it's the most brilliant thing I'd ever heard. And you guys actually did a pilot with the Austin sort of region of the U.S. Postal Service and had this thing humming. Everything was going great. And then y'all went to D.C. and met with the Obama administration, the Postmaster General. Tell us how that meeting
Yeah, so we met with the general. They call him the 4-star, the Postmaster General. It's a really interesting thing. It's the second largest union in the world. And he'd grown up a letter carrier. And in some sense, there's real nobility in that. Anyway, we get this call to go meet in D.C. And we were like, all right, this is it. This is the big deal. We're going to cement this national expansion. It's going to be wonderful. So it's L'Enfant Plaza, which is in D.C. It's the fake Louvre, that like terrible fake glass pyramid, just like a perfect representation of our government. So anyway, we go into this building. We go to the top floor. It's the executive boardroom, and it's this windowless conference room with this really long table. And we go and we have this meeting, and the C team is there, the general counsel, COO, head of digital, and the postmaster general. And they knew a little about us. We had sent a brief, and we kind of go around the table thinking that this is exploratory, let's build rapport. So we give a few-minute opening on, here's what we're learning, we so admire, REITs, sleet, rain, or snow, you guys, how many Huskies do you guys own? Because they deliver on like the Iditarod style thing in Alaska. Anyway, trying to ingratiate ourselves. So we go around, the general counsel's like, well, this is illegal for these 3 reasons. And we're like, well, we work with this law firm and we think it's okay. And then the head of operations is like, there's no way this will work. And we said, well, we have this pilot. We think it's kind of working. My favorite was the head of digital, whose most recent job was the head of the Global Union of Letter Carrier Unions, based in Brussels, of course. And he's 70 years old, and he says, the problem with Outbox is it won't work because digital is a fad. And we were just like, all right, this is not going to go well. And finally, the most honest person in the room was the Postmaster General, who's like, guys, what you've built is really cool. The problem is the people that you're serving are not our customer. Our customer is mass mailers as advertisers, and our product to that customer is a guaranteed delivery of their junk mail onto the kitchen tables of Americans. And I was like, why am I not recording this right now? You know, like, what a crazy thing to say. But he was actually right. That's how he sees the business. And that meant that we were not a partner, but a competitor. And government has infinite time, infinite money, and infinite ability to regulate. And those are three things you do not want in a competitor.
Hard to argue with that. So when basically after Outbox more or less got shut down in that meeting, I mean, for you, that was one of the first moments, probably, would you say, the biggest failure in your life to that point?
Yeah, right. So you're in the news, you raise all this money, there's all these hopes, you're all these Facebook posts, and you're kind of building all this hype about the thing, and then it's like, this thing's not going to work. It's kind of a crazy story. So we go to our investors, we had a few million in cash left, and we're like, we think we should just sort of pro rata this back and shut down. There's no way it's going to work. And Mike Maples was like, guys, keep the money. We're like, Mexico. No, we said, what do you mean keep the money? He said, you guys have built an amazing team, and he shared the following brief story. So Mike was trying to get into venture capital, had taken a company public from Austin, moved to the Bay, and it's go-go years. It's like 2005, money's everywhere, and he can't find anyone to take his investments. He finally meets this guy, and he makes a $250,000 investment in this company called Odeo, which is a precursor to podcasting. 1 week after that investment, iTunes announces the podcast product, and it just eviscerates the business. So the guy calls him and is like, Mike, I'm really sorry. We're just going to wire the money back. We got to shut down. And Mike's like so embarrassed. This was his first investment. He's like, are you working on anything else? Like, could you just keep the money for something else? And this guy sort of flubs through explaining this other idea that he had. And Mike had no idea what he was talking about. He's like, just keep the money. That was Twitter. And so Mike 100x the fund on Twitter. And Mike's lesson from that is basically bet on teams. And so for him, he takes that all the way to the extreme of like, the whole business you had just died. But like, I'm betting on the team, and the team hasn't changed, so just build something else.
So you wound up building Able, which is a lending company. That wound up getting acquired, and you wound up leaving and going to run Teneo full-time, which you had started, I guess, what had that been, like 8 or 9 years previously?
Right.
So tell us a little bit about Teneo and what y'all are working on. I know that's really been your big passion, for the last sort of 10 or 12 years. Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah. Well, so I feel like I didn't give the full answer on like the failure piece. I think
talk more about your failure.
Well, I just think like there's a weird thing in like the startup world where it's like you really want to celebrate failures. And so it's like you go kind of down in flames. But there were definitely a lot of really dark periods of that. Does anyone, raise your hand, you don't take the Enneagram? You guys know what the Enneagram is? If you've not taken it, it's like mind-blowing for me. So I'm a 3. So all the 3 really cares about is like reputation, right? So my question, I'm all, what are people thinking? How's this talk going? What are they going to say, right? That's the 3's problem. And so a public failure like that for a 3 is like a death sentence. And so I had a great counselor, I had a great therapist. I will say this, the partnership through that really was vital for us to be there as like the OG, the original 2 people that were like, we are in this together. Why are we doing this thing? We're doing this thing because it's our best understanding of what God has called us to do. And I've met a lot of people that made a lot of money, and it was probably clear that that was not in God's plan for them. And so we came out of this, and so could you really get yourself to a place where you're so detached that the business's success and the money made, you actually feel indifferent to? Now, not that you should not care about it, but could you actually get to a place your identity is so rooted in Christ that you feel, at the gates, it is well done, good and faithful servant with a record of 100 failures. I'm not there, but that experience at least taught me that that's something that's worth thinking about.
So going back to that group of guys from HBS, I know that during the time when Outbox was sort of, went from here to here, that was a big part for you and Chrissy of being able to kind of walk through that. And then also, not long after that, you wound up losing your brother, and I know that was a big part of that too. Can you talk about sort of how that group, what role your community and your sort of your faith community played in being able to walk through sort of those dark times?
Yeah. Well, there's a kind of a haunting but powerful line. There's a guy, Hugh Hewitt, who's a writer, radio host guy that I respect a lot. He was speaking at this event that I host about 7 or 8 years ago, and he said, the thing about your generation, these sort of type A young people, is that you are not prepared to suffer. That your entire life has basically been, you're on your toes, you're seeking opportunity. When something dangerous is coming at you, what do? You get out of the way. And you find a way to like keep the whole story packaged together. And he, as a wise older person, was like, what you need to do is to be prepared to suffer. And I was like, man, this is a really good message, Hugh. I'm so glad you delivered it for everyone else. And I had my moment, right? So it's, I don't know if you guys have had any experiences like this, but it's the literal 3 a.m. phone call. It's a text message you hear, call me ASAP. You get the phone call. It's my mom who says that my brother had died in a car crash. And I was at this conference with a friend of mine. We were roommates. You like are in a daze and you get packed up and is it true? Is this a dream? You're driving and you get there. And it was just a horrible several days, right? It was just a horrible several days with so many piercing memories. We went straight to the crash site. It had already been cleared. I was rummaging through just the dirt where the car had run into this huge tractor, and I found this little ball marker that had been in his cup holder, and it said, "Think Birdie." And I just found it kind of in the dirt. So we took that and we made bracelets, and it was kind of a theme. Another one was where these things are so crazy, especially with an unexpected death, where at the funeral home and you're asking all these questions, right? My dad looks at me and he's like, we're picking out a casket. And he's like, would Scott like gray? Right? Like, we've never talked about that. And so I think I was really hit with that experience, pretty unprepared for that, right? Like I had tools and tricks and the 5 Fs and the 4 Ps and all these methodologies. And the thing that really hit me was that, grieving, it's not like you have 100 grieving utils and you just go do it, right? So if you work really hard, you grieve for like 4 days and you've like finished it. It was one of the first things in my life that really felt out of my control. And so grieving came in waves, and it came through relationships, right? So those guys, one of them was out of the country, but the other 5 flew there that day. It was hundreds of letters from dear friends sharing similar experiences. And a really crazy one, back to my frustration with my hometown, was, I think Midland's like this, I don't know, but it's the place of a covered dish. People from church, they came in the morning and they just sat. I'm like, why are there still people sitting in here? But they were. They just were. And my wife was amazing in kind of walking through all that. And she grew up in New York City. They had lots of like special, interesting friends. But her mom had cancer. And what she got when her mom had cancer was a bunch of Harry and David fruit baskets. And what we got in a small town, in a deep connected community, was like old people on our couch, right? And it's very clear which one we would choose. So that event was just absolutely crazy and horrible. It has really galvanized how we think about our community in Austin, of just investing in the local church, investing in our neighbors. The crazy end of the story is I was just cut off. There we go. It's a sign. We have 1 minute left. We'll end on this maybe. A few weeks later, my wife had migraines, and she's a litigator, and so she was worried about all this health stuff. And anyway, so she comes downstairs one night, and she's like, honey, it's kind of crazy, but I'm pregnant. We were like, okay, we were totally not trying for that. We had 2 already. We thought we were done. And then it's really early, so we don't know. So 6 weeks later, she's in California. She has this medical thing. She goes into the ER, and she gets a scan, and she calls me. She's like, I'm really worried. I think I may have lost the baby. So I'm at home putting my big kids to bed in Austin, and so it's just this terrible hour. And she calls, and she says, well, there's amazing news. There's a heartbeat. I'm like, oh, my gosh, this is unbelievable. Well, there's more news. There are actually 2 heartbeats. So she was pregnant with twins, and at that point they could do the skull calculation and get the date of conception, which was to the day that my brother died, the day I was out of town at a conference. And so my brother's name is Scott, and the boy twin is Scott, who was, per medical science, says he was brought into the world that same day.
Real quick, just as we wrap up, we didn't really get to talk much about Teneo, but just sort of what's one thing you're working on through Teneo that you're really excited about, that maybe something that everybody around here could be thinking about in their own lives too?
Yeah. Well, love to talk about Teneo after people want to hang out. The mission behind Teneo is just grew out of my deep affection for this country. I really believe that the American experience is the crafting of the founding of this country is the third greatest thing in world history. The first being the death and resurrection of Jesus. The second is the invention of the double drive-through at Chick-fil-A. And then the third was the beginning of America. And anyway, like you guys, if you love the Lord and you love the country, you look around and you see what's happening and probably feel a lot of frustration about that. Teneo is a response to that, to say, how do we find the best and the brightest people? To say, I'm not happy to just sit on the sidelines. Yes, let's write some checks. Maybe we'll vote the right way, but let's do big things for freedom and for our faith. And Teneo is an organization, a little bit like YPO, that does that with a network of about 1,000 young gun types around the country. What are we working on right now? I'll end with this. I got to be with President Trump at the prayer breakfast last week, which was a really crazy deal, and it's a wild time. And here's what happened. So Arthur Brooks from AEI gets up and gives this talk about loving your enemy. So this is literally 2 mornings after Nancy is sitting behind the president and rips up the State of the Union. So it's Arthur speaks and sits down. Donald Trump is at the podium. 2 to his left is Nancy Pelosi. They had not been in the same room since the State of the Union. And Donald Trump gets up there and he says, well, Arthur, after Arthur's speech, love your enemy. He says, Arthur, I think I'm going to disagree. And he gives this speech about hating people that pray for him, but they knows they're not. Anyway, it's kind of a really crazy event. After it, Eric Metaxas, who I love, has this little small group thing. He says, if I could have 5 minutes, I would make this point to the president. Loving your enemy is not about liking your enemy. There are people that fight against you day in and day out, and it's okay to do almost everything up until the point of hating them. You can strongly dislike them. The biblical command to love your enemy is actually radically different and has very little to do with liking them. It is based on the fundamental recognition that that person that you feel is trying to destroy you, trying to kill you possibly, is the same person, the same kind of person that Christ died for specifically. So that unifying factor, that Christ died for your enemy just as much as he died for you, is the radical equalizer, and we have a long way to go. So with that, love your enemy, and I've got some questions, I think.
Yeah, here you go.
Kyle, we're going to sit down for about 5 minutes and discuss at our tables, and then we're going to invite Evan back up to take some questions from the floor.
All right, 5 minutes of discussion, and then Evan will be back up for Q&A.